Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final one of our webinar series. Where has it gone? The last 9 weeks. We've had 9 1-hour workshops around Canva, infographics, photography, websites, all sorts of good stuff. If you've missed them all, where have you been? But don't worry, they have all been recorded and shared on the Impact Toolkit program. And that's also our YouTube link, which I will put in the chat for you because all the videos are there as well. And what we've got is not only the full webinars, which you can watch back, but also assets that have been mentioned. We've edited some of them into the kind of the core snippets, loads of resources and lots of things for you to lots of rabbit holes to go down, as we discovered when we were looking at some of these bits, but go and enjoy all of those. This is me, Lucy Payne. You already know that. You've been on all these webinars before. Housekeeping for everybody is this is a webinar. So if you want to ask questions, you can't do it in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A and we will answer them as we go along. We try and answer those questions in the moment because one of my favorite things about doing things online is you don't have to wait until the end of someone speaking, by which point your question's kind of lost its point. So put them in there, and if we can't get to them in the moment, we will answer them on the platform, and I might save it until an opportune moment, and I'll make sure we ask the right person. So there you go. I kept it really quickly because we've got so much content to talk about today, which is fabulous. We could talk about making podcasts. Why would we want to do that? Where do we start? Fear not, we have the people in the room to help you with it. We have Gareth Evans from 1860, we have Sam Story from New College in Swindon, and we have Liesl Dawson from Bristol University, who have different experiences. As Liesl just said, she's going to talk about the technical stuff, but also has an amazing podcast called the Good Grief Podcast. So she's gone through this journey. So we're going to take you on a little bit of a journey on this because I know you all like the nuts and bolts of how to get started. So that is me done, and I'm going to hand over to Gareth to get us started on where to start, basically. Because doing a podcast feels like a good idea, but it also, as there's been a theme with websites and no code, it always feels a little bit daunting. So we all need to know, where do we start? Over to you, Gareth.
Hello, I'm just going to get my slides up. There you go. There you go. So yeah, hi. Can you see my face as well, Lucy?
Can indeed, yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I run 18660 and we're a podcast production agency, and we work with a lot of very brands of all different shapes and sizes, some global brands and some other smaller businesses as well. And my background was as a radio producer for like 10 years or so. I worked at Absolute Radio, if anyone has heard of that one. So, everything that we do as a business is rooted in making podcasts for an audience. And so what I hope I can share with you today is I'm calling it 10 steps to podcast success, because it can mainly because it's a nice way of rhyming the title, but hopefully it'll give you a framework for thinking about, if you want to use podcasts to connect with your audience and share the work that you're doing, the most important thing is that you're making it for the benefit of that person rather than making it to meet your own ends. So hopefully some of the things that I'll go through today will help you in that thinking. So that's a couple of the podcasts that we make. They're both about nature in this sense. And I think the thing that connects both of them is nature. And what we want to do with these podcasts is we want to bring nature to life for that audience. So both of the audiences for those podcasts are people who have an affinity with nature. They enjoy spending time in nature. For Waterlands, they're interested in the environment and ecology and things like that. So that roots all our decision making for those two podcasts. And as a result, we've won some awards. I'm not going to sort of blow our trumpet too much. So on to the first one, because I know we've got quite a lot to get through. So as I mentioned, the most important thing is the audience. So when you're making a podcast, it's very easy to come at it from the point of view, I've got this thing to talk about, And a podcast seems a good way of communicating it to people, which is great. But the other side of that is you need to be thinking about who you're going to be making it for and why they would want to listen. So with a podcast, it's different to other forms of media. So if you think about videos on social media feeds, or to an extent, sort of blog content and written content, it's a lot easier to come across that content and then have it catch your eye and then consume it. With a podcast, you generally need to take some time and some extra steps to listen to it. So you've got to put your headphones on most of the time. You've got to open your podcast app. You've got to search for it. So you have to make an extra effort with podcasts to make sure that you're making it for somebody. So the questions that you want to be asking are, who are you making it for, and what do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do after listening to your podcast? Think about who they are. What do they love? What are they into? How is your content and the things that you want to talk about going to connect with what you know about those? And one thing that when I first started my career in radio, one of the first things that people told me was, you're making that radio program for that one person sat at home listening to the radio, and it's exactly the same with podcasts. Even more so, really, because most podcast listening is done with headphones on. So you need to be talking to that one person. If you skip this phase, then, as I said, your podcast can become quite you'll be coming at it from a self-serving perspective. So think about how you can make that one listener's life a little bit better by hearing your podcast. So you know who your audience is. So what do you want to achieve from that podcast? Is it to drive awareness of the work that you're doing? Is it because you've got some amazing new ideas that you just have to tell people about? Think about what other people might be doing similar things to you, and what can you do to stand out from those other podcasts. So the two things that you need to be thinking about is audience and objectives. And we like to talk about this sweet spot between what your audience wants to hear and what they need and what you want to be talking about. And that bit in the middle is where you want to focus your attention. Either way, in either direction, you're not really going to be hitting the mark. So whenever we're making a podcast, the first thing we do is spend a lot of time talking to the people that we're making the podcast with, be it a brand, business, organization, and we find out who their listener is and why they want to be listening. And we're asking lots of those sorts of questions. Why are people going to find this interesting? Why are you doing this? And that helps them think more from their audience's perspective. So once you've come up with those thoughts and you've done that bit of thinking, then the aim is to come up with what I like to call the podcast DNA. So this is the thread that holds everything together. So podcasts work best when they tap into a niche. And that niche could be the topic. It could be the fact that nobody's really talking about what you have to talk about. It could be the way that you present that topic. So maybe there is lots of people talking about that content. And let's go back to that nature example that I gave you at the start. The first one, the first image there was a podcast we make called A Life More Wild. So it's all about nature and it's about the outdoors. There are lots of podcasts out there, or there were lots of podcasts out there at the time that talked to people and had an interview maybe recorded like this, about why people love nature. But the niche of that podcast is that we record those conversations with people out in nature. So we spend an hour and a half with them wandering around and chatting to them outside, and that it becomes the niche of the podcast. So it doesn't necessarily, your niche doesn't necessarily have to be the content, but it could be the way that you present it, and the format that you come up with. So talking about formats, most of the time, podcasts take the form of interview podcasts. And if you listen to podcasts, there's a good chance that your favorite podcast is an interview podcast. But there are lots of other ways of making a podcast, and that could be, it could be more of a storytelling podcast. It could be you as the person who is the kind of the main focus, and maybe you just rely on other people to help shape what you're saying. And then it could be storytelling podcasts. There are podcasts which are recorded in kind of a live environment. So don't be blinkered into thinking that your podcast has to be one thing. It could be micro episodes. Each episode could be 5 minutes long. Then there could be a reason why they're 5 minutes long. A completely different example, which probably won't be may or may not be relevant to you, is there was a company that make I think it was toothpastes, or it could be toothbrushes. But the point of their podcast was they wanted to create a podcast which was the ideal length to listen to while children were brushing their teeth. So they made short 2-minute stories which kids could listen to while they were brushing their teeth. That's a much more exciting, interesting, engaging, entertaining podcast than a 20-minute conversation about why children should brush their teeth for 2 minutes. So have fun with the format, and don't be led into thinking a podcast needs to be a conversation between two people recorded over Zoom. I would say after audience, the second most important thing is to be committed. So podcasts, if you want to throw yourself into it properly and see reap the rewards from it, they're built on consistency and frequency. So there's a fact that 90% of podcasters quit after just 3 episodes because they expect to see those results, and you're not going to see those results after that short period of time. So know what you can commit to and go for the maximum that you can produce. So be as frequent as you can, with as regular episodes as you can, and that's more likely to build your audience. So thinking about strategy, we've spoke about objectives and why you might want to launch a podcast, but if you are creating other forms of content, it could be specific research papers. Maybe you have a blog that you also write. How can you leverage those forms of content for your podcasts? So if you've got a blog, for instance, you might want to make sure that for every episode of the podcast that you publish, you also publish a new blog post, because you know that there's an audience already consuming that content. And the great thing about a podcast is it can give you lots of other forms of content. So one episode of a podcast you might be able to turn it into a blog post, or 3 social media posts, or a short video clip. And the great thing about a lot of the AI tools, or the AI powered tools that are around at the moment, is they make that stuff really easy. With a bit of training on your part, you can get some software to spit you out a blog post based on the podcast episode that you've just recorded.
Gareth, we've got a question about multiple interviewee podcasts. Someone who the Listening Project on Radio 4 has conversations between two
Yeah,
people with related experiences. And this person is thinking of pairing couples to talk about their experiences of the partner immigration system. So 4 people.
yeah.
Any thoughts or advice? My gut feeling is that you want to script that quite well. There's planning, isn't it, as you said?
Yeah, so those I think those forms of podcasts work best when they've, you need one person in charge, you need one person who's chairing that conversation. It can become quite messy if there's nobody in charge. So I was just chatting to someone earlier on today about this exact thing, and my suggestion to them was, have a trained presenter who knows what they're doing, who can ask those questions. It might be that you are the presenter of that, so you need to be the one who can keep that conversation ticking along. And also, the other important thing is to make sure other people don't feel left out, and that you are bringing that person into the conversation. And you only have to look at, and maybe watch an episode of Newsnight, for instance. The presenter is there to bring those different people in at the right moments, and that's the role that you need to play if you're.
It's not for their voice to be the thing that's the most heard, isn't it? Sometimes it's just that they just keep it ticking and keep it focused, and
Yeah,
and bring it back potentially.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
This step actually kind of leads on from that a little bit. So it's thinking about the content. So you need to be thinking about what you want to ask that person in the interview, and what topics you want to cover. When you invite a guest on for a podcast, nearly all the time they'll ask, can you let me know what the questions are? Can you let me know what you're going to be talking about? I always advise people to avoid giving people a list of questions, because all they do is they prepare their answers. But definitely give them a steer on that, we'd like to talk to you about these things, and give them a list of bullet points. Not enough information that they can prepare. Otherwise, it stops the conversation from sounding natural. And this all comes back to that podcast DNA that I spoke about. So let that shape all the decisions. So if your podcast DNA is to uncover the real reasons behind a particular topic, and you know who that audience is, then make sure all your questions are feeding into that DNA and that guiding principle, if you like. It can become really easy to get bogged down in questions that aren't really relevant for your podcast or your audience, especially when you get opportunities to interview someone who might, on the face of it, seem like an amazing person to interview. But if that person, always need to ask yourself, is this person right for our podcast and for my audience? There's a lot of podcasts out there that where people interview people just because they want to interview them. That's a very self-serving way of doing it. You need to be as happy to say no to the best guests as you are to say yes to them. I know Sam's going to talk a lot about this later, and he'll go into some more technical details for you, but it pays these days to sound good. One of the great things about podcasts is the low bar to entry, but that also means that there is a lot of quality divergence out there. And whereas a few years ago, people could put up with the fact that a podcast doesn't sound that great, the more of us who become podcast listeners, and that number keeps going up year on year, the more of us are used to hearing podcasts from the likes of the BBC, or our favorite TV shows, or our favorite experts to follow online. And if your podcast doesn't sound as good as those, then they'll just switch off. So aim for the best quality you can, Avoid recording on things like Teams and Zoom if you can help it, and use remote recording software like Riverside or Zencaster or one of those, or make sure you're recording locally, or find a professional producer, maybe a freelancer who can help you out. Or if in doubt, podcast studios are becoming prevalent in lots of places, and then a lot of them are fairly affordable.
I think our headsets are better now. I think we maybe were less aware of how bad it was as well. Our earpods and things are really great now.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like, as I said, most people listen to podcasts on headphones where you're a lot more immersed in the sound. And for instance, this room that I'm in now, it's got a glass ceiling, it's got hard walls. Me speaking to you, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of reverb. It sounds quite nice in here. But if I was to put a mic in here and record myself on a mic, it would sound awful. It would sound really reverby, echoey, however you want to describe it. And the microphone just enhances all of that. So just pay careful attention to the quality and get it as good as you can. And as I said, Sam's going to talk to you about that anyway. Step 9 is distribution. So in short, your podcast should be everywhere your listener might want to find it. So most people listen to podcasts either on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I saw a great stat the other day that said that around 50% of people in the UK listen on apps that aren't Apple and Spotify, which was interesting. So that means that if your podcast isn't on Overcast or Pocket Casts or I don't know, Podbean or any of the other apps that people might want to listen on, then you are putting a barrier in the way to somebody listening. And that goes for YouTube as well. So as of the last couple of weeks, Google Podcasts has been axed. It's no more. And Google want you to now listen to all your podcasts on YouTube Music. That doesn't mean your podcast needs to be video, but it does mean that if you've got an Android device and you want to listen to a podcast, the kind of default device would be YouTube. So
an interesting question from John actually on that, Gareth, is he said that Zencaster doesn't allow you to delete recordings. So obviously that means not GDPR compliant. That's really weird, isn't it? But RiverStation is. Obviously RiverStation can. I don't know about these platforms, but I don't know if you've experienced that.
I don't use Zencaster that much. It's been ages since I've used it. We use Riverside and Squadcast, the ones that we've used, and you can delete things off there. As far as I knew, they were deleted. I don't know what their own privacy policies are.
Cool.
But yeah, I suppose the question to ask is, I suppose that anyone getting involved in a podcast interview should know that their content is going to be available on multiple platforms online for a finite amount of time, unless you specify anything other than that with them. Final point is promotion. So it's a lot of people can get bogged down in putting all of the effort into the type of mic they're gonna get and the what questions they're going to ask people, and then they'll go to all the effort and they'll hit publish, and then they'll watch the stats and wait to see how many people are listening. And unless you have the promotional strategy to go along with it, you might find that those results aren't what you want them to be. Because as I said, people need to go through several steps to listen to a podcast. It's very hard to just stumble across it and listen. So have a think about what other content you might be producing. Are there other blogs that you can get people talking about it? You might want to create specific social media content around it, and then if you know that you've put all of your effort, as much of your effort into promoting your podcast as you have into producing it, then you know that you've done all you can, and then it's just a case of being patient and waiting. Don't expect results in the first few episodes. That's it for me.
Thank you, Gareth. I mean, to be fair, as I expected, there's quite a lot of planning. And I was thinking about, I was going to ask you what the ideal length is for a podcast, but I guess you have to take the step back and get that data on the demographic.
Yeah. So yeah, it depends on who you're making it for. I suppose there's a wisdom that, you know, that 20 minutes, 25 minutes is a nice amount of time to listen to. A lot of people listen while they're commuting.
Yeah.
And I heard a stat once that said 20 minutes was the average commute time. But you know, if you're making a podcast for very busy people, then you want to be as careful with their time as possible. I'm very much in the camp that a really well edited 25-minute interview where you've had to be fairly ruthless with the content is much better than a 55-minute, 1 hour 20 conversation that can go off in different directions. So it's all in the edit, I think.
Yes, and that's another whole conversation. When you've got all that content that you create, the editing is the next piece. We can't go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah,
Because
it's a big topic.
it is, because I think, but back in that planning, what is essential for you, for your audience to hear? You know, as you write, it's not for you to say, but for your audience to hear. No, thank you, Gareth. You alluded to what Sam's going to talk about now, because yeah, it's kind of, as you said, it used to be a little bit more, let's record something on our phones. That's just not good enough quality. So Sam, sitting there in your podcast studio, as if you knew what we were talking about today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Lucy. Can you hear me okay? Because I
We-
changed microphones.
We can.
Great. So the first thing I'm going to say is going to completely contradict the last thing that you've said, which is I think your phones are good enough. I think at least it's a starting point. It's an entry point for anyone whose ambition is to make a podcast. I think the first thing to say is you can just make it. You don't have to buy anything. You can literally just make it with stuff you already own and equipment that's or a software that's free to use and equipment that you already own. So if I was going to do it for zero budget, I would use the voice memo app on my phone, and I would just sit here like this, and I would just talk, and I'd get my guests to do the same thing. And the key thing, though, to make it easy for yourself in the edit is you've got to have a noise that you can sync up with at the start. But that approach, although it's using equipment that you already own and free software, does require you to know how to edit, which is what we were just talking about. And editing is tricky.
Yes.
Have you got your hand up, Gareth?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say just to back that up. We often have, when we're recording podcasts for different clients, we'll often get the guest to record on their smartphone. So the presenter has their professional mic like you've got, and we ask the guest to record on their phone. In an ideal world, hold it like this, because that's where the best position the microphone is, or if not, just down here. And usually, because iPhones and other smartphone microphones have got so good, usually the quality of that is better than what you would get out of a laptop mic.
It can be better because there's less that can go wrong. When you buy a professional mic and you're using an audio interface, there are more variables to fine tune the results, but there are more areas for more potential hazards to know how to avoid, I suppose. Okay.
If we're taking it to the next step, you have some ideas. I mean, and we obviously will, we can't go too much into this, but I might ask you afterwards to share some editing tool recommendations with me, which we can put into the platform.
I've got some in my slides, actually. There's one in
Perfect.
particular that I would recommend, which I will recommend.
Cool.
Yeah,
Good
absolutely.
stuff. Cool.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk about equipment that you might want to use, how to enhance your environment to its maximum potential, and the technique that you ideally would try to aim for in your own delivery and your own use of the equipment. So to start a podcast, you're going to need well, you could just start with your phone. When you're on your upgrade path, you've done a few episodes with your phone and you want to actually enhance the quality, you're going to need a microphone, an interface, and a pair of headphones. And these are the three specific items that I'm going to be talking about, the actual make and model of these items I'm going to be talking about today. I'll just give you a brief overview of some terms that, if you're not familiar with the technology, might throw you off or get you sort of asking questions. When you start looking at microphones, you might come across the terms dynamic and condenser. They're both microphones. Dynamic microphones don't need power. They work in different ways. That's the limit of my technical knowledge. I just know that they do work in different ways. Dynamic microphones don't require power. And they're a bit more focused, a little bit more, they reject off-axis noise a little bit better, but they tend to be a little bit mid-forward in terms of the frequency response. But actually that can be a good thing. Condenser mics have a flatter frequency response. They're much more sensitive, and they require power, which is usually powered through the XLR cable. So you don't plug them in or put batteries in, or they're powered by something called phantom power. But I would recommend a dynamic mic as your starting point. If you want to buy a microphone, I would suggest a dynamic mic. They're just a lot easier. A condenser mic, especially like a large diaphragm condenser like this, will pick up the sound of the room. Gareth mentioned about how rooms can be reverberant, which doesn't sound particularly nice, and a condenser mic will be more sensitive to that environment than a dynamic mic. The other thing you might want to consider is whether you get a USB mic or an XLR mic. USB microphones are much more convenient for capturing a single source. You just plug them in and your computer recognizes them. But they become a little bit more problematic when you want to record multiple microphones in the same room. So if you're inviting a guest in and you want them to have a separate microphone, there is software that you can get that will allow your computer to see that microphone as a virtual source, or let me put it another way, it sees both microphones as one virtual source. So your computer can capture both of them at the same time, but that then has its own pitfall, making it harder to edit because it sums those inputs, so you can't extract them and alter the volume of one but not the other. An XLR microphone gives you a good upgrade path because you can then change your audio interface. If you can get a fairly cheap audio interface for one XLR input, and then if your podcast grows and you start inviting guests in more frequently, you can get an audio interface that has multiple XLR inputs. But I'm going to recommend a microphone that has got XLR and USB. So it's a relatively cheap microphone. I don't think you can do much better for the price. For 50 quid, this one will do exactly what you want it to do. It will give you an enhanced sound, and it gives you a start point for recording a single source as well as a potential upgrade path as you move forwards. And it comes with a little tripod, so that's nice. That was the example that I had of being able to just start this for free. Use your phone. The interface allows your computer to capture audio from several devices at once, as I've just said. So you can see this Focusrite interface that I've got up here has got two XLR inputs, and they've both got a gain dial, so you can adjust the sensitivity of both microphones at once. The one in the picture, I think that's a Universal Audio, has got 4 inputs. You can get them with the one I'm looking at right now has got 12 microphone inputs. I've never had 12 people in this room all at once. It would be a bit crowded, I think. But like I said, there is software that allows you to do something similar with USB microphones. It's this one here. It's called Voicemeeter, Virtual Audio Mixer. It's donationware, which means it's free to download and use. And if you want to donate, you can. And it sees both microphones and gives you one output, so that where you're recording sees one input, but you are then able to mix on the fly, but means that it sums those inputs, meaning that you won't be able to do any post editing to separate the two voices. This is probably what I would say is the entry point for having an audio interface that is actually going to be useful to you. And this one's really useful because it's got 4 XLR inputs. They've each got gain. It's got, I think, multiple headphone, so more than one person can listen at once, but it is also a recorder. So you can record straight onto this, which is really nice. And you can record with separate channels. So it will record each input with its own channel so that you can do that editing afterwards. And what that means is you can go anywhere. Your podcast studio can be any room that that suits you and that you can sit down and start recording in. So you don't need to use it as an interface. You can use it as a standalone podcast recorder. It also doubles as an interface. So for me, that would be the one that I would get. And to be honest, you can't do really any better for less than 150 quid anyway. Most podcasters find it important to monitor their microphone in real time. It can take some getting used to. You probably have headphones at home. You probably, if I just go back to the microphone, it's got a headphone so you can jack, so you can monitor your own microphone, and you can just do it with your Apple earbuds. If you've no longer used them because a 3.5mm jack is now obsolete, they're probably in a drawer somewhere. You might even have some older headphones like this mustachioed guy to the left. If you want to buy a new pair of headphones, this is a really good pair for the money. So I would probably advise against trying to save money by buying a cheaper pair. This is really going to be the entry point. It will cover your ears. It will block out some external sound, and it'll just allow you to know what you're hearing. And what it does is it alerts you to whether you might have gone too far back away from your microphone just because you kind of forget that in the moment that you're recording, and it just reminds you to use your mic technique, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Oh no, I'm going to talk about environment. So we've already talked about different environments. Most environments will sound a bit reverberant, and they will let in a bit of external sound as well. Do what you can to reduce that and to enhance the acoustic quality of the space. Furniture is a really good way of breaking up those reverberations, especially the softer the better. I heard that during COVID lockdown, voiceover artists were crawling under their duvet on their bed and recording their voiceovers and sending it to their clients just with a duvet over their head. And it just stops that reverberation and that room noise from interfering with the sound. Sorry, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a bit. For technique, it's really simple. A palm, 4 fingers width away from the mic, and make it off axis. If you talk straight into your microphone, you create plosive sounds. It can sound a bit more sibilant. So dynamic mics pick up high frequencies on axis much more. If you go slightly off axis, it will make your voice sound a bit warmer. You won't get those pops, those pop sounds. And the other thing is to remember not to be overly dynamic in terms of the volume of your voice. Although podcasts can be conversational, they aren't conversations, and your audience won't have the same sensitivity to varying levels of volume as another human in the room would have. So you need to try to remember that, and try to keep your head in roughly the same position, same distance from the mic. Try to keep the level of your voice roughly the same. I mean, you don't have to stress about it. Just knowing that will change the sound is probably enough. Oh, I do have, actually, really quickly, I'm going to show you a couple of things. I got props. In terms of an upgrade path, you might want to get a boom arm so that you can position your microphone in the right position. You might want to get a little mic holder to stop noise coming from your desk. You might want to get a pop filter to stop those plosives. I really like metal ones because you can clean them more easily. So to me, I mean, I think it's kind of gross. As soon as something's this close to your mouth, I wouldn't want to use that unless I'd given it a wipe first. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is acoustic treatment for your room. So slightly better than a duvet is this wooden frame that's filled with insulation, and that will stop the room from being too reverberant, as I said earlier. And you can see actually behind me, this room, there's quite a lot of that. So this room's quite dead sounding. Anyway, sorry. Okay, that's it.
And
I'm
Sam,
done.
I don't think we actually explained where you are today. You're in the podcast room, New College Swindon Institute of Technology.
Yeah, so at the IoT in Swindon, we've got an amazing podcast studio that you can see, which doubles as a video editing room and a control room for our film studio, and also for recording voiceover and lines of dialogue and so forth. We do it in this room because of the acoustic treatment, and it's got a red light outside that says, "I'm busy, don't knock on the door." People still do, but
It's such a cool
thankfully they
space.
haven't today. Yeah, it's really nice.
There's so much investment's been made, and there's so much you do. There's every kind of recording going on, and your role, you're helping students, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually use podcasts as a form of assessment now with the added problems that AI have created in terms of plagiarism. Podcasts are a really great way of finding out what a student knows in a way that they feel is kind of less formal. It's kind of it's interesting to. Plus, they're actually setting up and recording and producing the podcast, so they're learning the technical skills.
There's loads of skills there that they're learning without even realizing.
Exactly.
It's really cool. So I wanted to get you involved because we do a lot of work in Swindon, and I think it's a fantastic space, and not enough people know about. Again, you haven't got to go and buy all these things. You may want to come and speak to your local college and find out who's got those resources. But thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now, Liesl, you've been through all of this journey. You've gone from wouldn't a podcast be a good idea? And on from there. So over to you.
Lovely. Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
So on the advice for editing, we're going to share some tools. I think we're going to run out of time. So hold that thought, because I want to hear from Liesl first. I think with editing, Gareth, do you want to do that in a quick answer before we hand over to Liesl?
Oh.
Yeah, okay. So there's two ways. There's the traditional route where you use audio waveforms and you use Adobe Audition, or you use I don't know, Hindenburg or Audacity, or all of these different tools. And then there is the new way, which is something called Descript, which is very cheap. You pay by the month, and the best way of thinking about that is imagine Google Docs, but when you deleted parts of your document, the audio also disappeared. So you don't need to edit in a read form. You can edit via text, and then it spits out the audio file, and it comes with loads of these AI tools that can create blog posts, social media posts, and all this.
You're editing the transcript. Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much. Sorry, Gareth, could dip you in there. Liesl, let's get back to you. We didn't want to not answer that question.
No, that's absolutely fine. Okay, I'm going to attempt again to share.
It worked perfectly in practice.
Did it work? Okay.
No, it hasn't yet. Go on. There we go.
There we go. How's that? Good?
Perfect.
Okay, good. So I suppose the first thing to say is that I'm actually talking about video, webinars, and podcasts today. So that is a little bit different, but hopefully there'll be things in common that are useful to hear about. So I'm going to structure this in 3 parts. I'm going to start very briefly by just telling a little bit about my story and background, sort of how I got into this. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the Good Grief Festival, just what it is, how we ended up doing these video webinars or podcasts. And in the second half, I'm going to talk about what I think are the key ingredients of a good video podcast, some of which will repeat and some of which will be slightly different. Okay, so in terms of me, so my research is in 16th and 17th century literature, not an obvious hopping off point for a festival about grief. However, if you look at my books, so one on lovesickness and an edited collection on revenge and gender, I think there's one hint of things to come in that both of these deal with emotion. So as well as having expertise in literature, I also research the history of emotion and psychology and the ways that historical ideas about feelings are similar to and different from our own. So it was my work really, I sort of moved into the area of grief and trauma, and through this started meeting other people across the university. So I did a very small Brigstow project with Jimmy Hay and Film. We made a short fiction film together called Lost Property, which was a completely new venture. And then through this, I met Lucy Selman, who's in palliative care and end-of-life care. And she was putting together a welcome application to hold an in-person citywide festival on grief to take place in May 2020. And before I moved to COVID, so the aims of the festival really to open up conversations about grief and death. We wanted to build a more open and compassionate society, and also to widen access to research about grief and bereavement. And when I heard about the festival, I just thought it sounded so exciting, something I could really find meaningful. And I thought I could sort of do something good. I had qualities that would work here, and I decided to sort of throw myself into the project in any way I could. So, but of course, COVID-19 hit. So it was scheduled for May 2020, and by March, we realized it couldn't go ahead as planned. So we decided to move the festival online. We changed it to a free online format. We had shorter sessions that were interactive when possible, and we also had some pre-recorded sessions. And while the events were all free, people could also subscribe to the online content for a year after the festival. So we actually generated quite a bit of income through those subscriptions. We used those to fund additional activities, in-person events. You can see some examples of those, as well as a lot more video content. And we use this time to grow our audiences. Okay, so that sort of takes us closer to the video webinars or podcasts. And so just to give you a bit of a sense of those, we have interviews, panel discussions. We also have chats between two people, interestingly. We did that at the beginning that weren't facilitated by other people. But we have a range of guests, including psychotherapists, actors, writers, artists, comedians, people with lived experience. I think our videos are both like and unlike podcasts. They're like podcasts in the way that they have a unifying theme with different guests and speakers, but they're different in the way that they're obviously videos. They are often live events with an online audience who can ask questions to us and to one another. So there's different kind of questions, I think, from a production side and in terms of a content side that we think about. This just shows you some of the people who have been guests or panel members. We sort of made a lot of this content, and then we moved it. We ended up creating a YouTube channel called The Grief Channel. So this was the thing that brought together our content and also arranged it into different playlists. And if you go on there, you can kind of look at our playlist, but it includes things like overcoming your fear of death, your grief toolkit. We have a playlist on children and young people, on the healing power of nature, and many others. Okay, this brings me to part 2, which is what are the ingredients of a good video webinar / podcast? Again, some of these I think we've already covered, but you might hear them in a slightly different form. Okay. First of all, I think you might want to think about branding, logo, developing a kind of image or something before you get started. We spent a bit of time with Good Grief developing the moth logo. It's like a, that we use on everything. It sort of moves across different platforms so people recognize it. But when I first went onto YouTube, I just found a logo that I just bought and stuck it on. So you can kind of do it expensively and you could do it cheaply. So you might want to think about that. I think title and image are incredibly important. You might have absolutely fantastic, interesting material, but if you don't have a good title and you don't have a poppy image, it's harder to pull that audience in. And just, I put a couple things up in the slideshow. So the first one, Julia Samuel on the guilt monster, grief's complicated sidekick. You can imagine if this was a research paper, you would write, what is the relationship between grief and guilt? You know, something much more dry. So it's thinking about ways to present the material, to give it catchy titles, and to pull people in. And again, the Superhero's Guide to Grief. It's also thinking about ways to bring in audiences. Okay, a lot of people don't want to talk about death. They don't want to talk about grief. What are some of the ways we might pull young people in or different audiences? And Marvel and superheroes might be one way to do that. And we use the arts quite a lot to try to bring audiences in. Okay, next ingredient, I think, are the guests. One thing I think you might think about is inviting people who are going to bring their own audiences. So this is a kind of shortcut to getting people to know your podcast or your video cast, know who you are. I certainly sometimes search in podcasts for a specific person, find a podcast that way, and then end up liking that podcast and listening to more. I think also, I mean, one thing you can think of too is thinking about your competitors, like rather than simply, I don't know, making something different from the competitors, finding a way to invite them in, and they, of course, will bring their audiences. I think when you're doing something with research, bringing people in who will give your work authority can be really helpful. Also, when you have a bigger panel, thinking about how you balance the panel and the guests. Sometimes a range will bring different audiences in and also enrich that conversation. Sometimes you want to keep it quite narrow and really zoom in on a particular topic. Finally, in terms of guests, if you have one way to increase the impact of research is to bring in somebody famous. So I know we're saying don't just bring in people because you want to talk to them, but I also think it's a great way to open up people to something they might not tune into. So I did a project on grief education with one of the listeners, actually the audience is here, Rachel Hare and other people. And this is, you know, a slightly more possibly dry topic, but we brought in Michael Rosen as our guest, and it got really excellent numbers in terms of viewers and hits on YouTube. Okay, a next important ingredient is the interviewer and facilitator. With Good Grief, we have more than one. Several of us sit in that seat. You want to make sure you get the right people. I think for something like this, preparation is really vital. I always prepare far more material than I will ever need, so that whatever the guest wants to talk about, I'm kind of ready to go. And well, unlike what Gareth said, I actually always send questions to my guests. So, I mean, we are talking about a slightly longer format. It's our YouTube interviews, panel discussions are about an hour. So I don't fill up the whole hour with that, but the questions I provides a kind of structure. So for me, it's almost like a bit of teaching where there are things I would like ideally to cover, but I also want to be flexible enough to go where the conversation takes me. And it's true, sometimes prepping can get in the way. Sometimes you get so fixated, you aren't as spontaneous and open to the conversation. So that's something to watch. I think the other problem with prep, which I certainly sometimes have, is sometimes you do so much prep, you want to say all the points that you've prepared. And actually, as the interviewer, you have to also learn to hold back and you have that material, but you don't need to use it. I think another thing to think about are things like shorts or clips. Certainly on YouTube, we do a lot of shorts, and people who might not watch a whole 50 minutes might watch a 4-minute clip, a 30-second clip, and then again might find the longer video. So I think it's a really nice way of pulling people in, and having those can be on quite specific topics. So I've put a few down. It's just me in the water, Cat White on swimming through grief in the pandemic, the time machine. Nikit Shukla finds his mom's last cooked meal in the freezer. His mom has died and he's found her last cooked meal and talks about that. And Julia Samuel talking about PTSD and grief. So again, people might find these when they search in different ways, and that might be a nice way in. Finally, my final point is already been covered about promotion, but social media, again, you can make fantastic content, but if you're not ready and have the time to really to do the social media, to do the promotion, then you might not find that audience. And that does take work. Our next steps, in case you're interested, is we're now looking to set up Good Grief as a social enterprise, aiming to educate and support bereaved people and professionals. I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope some of that material is helpful.
That was really helpful. I've got a question from John about consent forms. Is that something you had to do for your listeners? Yeah.
Well, we do it for any guests that we have.
Well, that's what I meant. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have a pretty big kind of catch-all where they basically, I don't want to say they sign their life away, but they say, we agree to this content being on this and lots of other channels where it might be. So they kind of give their consent to it being on YouTube, but also into other forms.
Gareth, have you ever had, Gareth, people being awkward with that? Is that something that people get worried about? Or people get, when we talk about editing, I mean, Liesl, to you as well, do people get worried about how they get edited?
Well, they mostly don't get edited. Again, like there's a bit of editing. They get edited into the shorts. But again, I think maybe part of the reason that I have those questions in advance is a lot of what we do is what we put out. We sometimes edit in like photographs or pictures or music when there's other content. Sometimes we just shorten things, but I think people haven't seemed to worry about that, actually, interestingly.
Gareth, have you had a similar experience? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, most of the time people know what they're getting involved in, and they know that if they're going to be on a podcast, then anything they say, is, unless they specifically say, oh, actually, they'll tell you if they've said something that, oh, actually, that's a bit confidential. Can we edit that out? And we always obviously would. But I'm always wary of sending things to guests to approve. At the end of the day, it's your podcast. You're the one in editorial control. I don't think they should be really shaping the narrative. That's your job.
I think we've had something similar where people have told a story or a bit and they felt it was too personal, and we have edited it out.
Yeah,
but we don't do it as a matter of course.
Yeah.
Go on, Sam.
There's a line you can put into a release form which says something like, you can edit at your discretion, provided that such edits do not distort the meaning of the statement. Something like that, which is really useful because then they know that they're going to be edited, but it kind of creates a bit of a two-way trust thing.
And I was going to say, Liesl, with your topic, I think it's something that lends itself very well to voices. So we talk about the quality of the sound, because if you're immersing it, you're going for a walk. I remember after my father died, I get Adam Buxton podcast. I went listened to, they had a conversation about the death. His mother had just died, and I was walking and having a little cry, and because they were with me in my head, and their voices and their tone, everything you brought on there, it really reached me, and it allowed me to be vulnerable. but I don't think I would have. I don't think watching it would have had the same experience for me. I know you can watch podcasts. That's a whole other thing that, you know, it's much more visual than it used to be. But just hearing people talking and being vulnerable was very powerful.
I think I've heard that podcast, if it's the one that I'm thinking on, the Carrie Ann Lloyd one, which is really good. I think the thing you get with the video, which you don't get with the podcast, is the community element. So when we do but you're absolutely right, the kind of intimacy is there with podcasts. But one thing we provide is when we do the live events, is the chat function is open, and people are talking to one another as well as listening to the podcast. And it becomes, you know, the best video podcasts or webinars are really intimate and interactive. And you feel, and I think people feel the isolation and loneliness of grief. And I think that gives a particular space for them to share things live. And then that material disappears. You know, it's not part of what gets released.
With people who understand where they are. Oh, we've got one final question from Amanda. Just want to say, if you're University of Bristol, they are getting ready to launch a new official University of Bristol podcasting site. So anyone wanting to make a podcast will need to do it through there. There's various costings depending on whether you just want them to host or whether you want help with making the podcast as well. The contact is Kirstine Dunhill in Central Comms. There we go. Useful. This is it. There are resources everywhere. So we talk about, you know, going and buying the equipment, but I know at University of Bath, the Innovation Centre there, we've been talking about whether we get a podcast suite together. It's a platform a lot of people are using. But I guess that what I'd say, the last thing is, Gareth, is we talked about how we can do it ourselves, do it on our phone, but coming to you and wrapping it through the whole service that you provide, because everything from the planning, and as you said, there's quite a lot of mapping at the beginning there, helping them through that process. If I think, right, I'm going to go and commission Gareth to create me a 20 podcast series on my fantastic project, and I know this is a very chicken and egg, I know what sort of budget should you be thinking of if you
So yeah, it really depends, and yeah, there are kind of different options dependent on different budgets. So if you are budget sensitive, then maybe finding a really good freelancer who you can pay, I don't know, £275 a day or £40 an hour or whatever it is, to edit your podcast. Look for someone who's got some really great experience. Look for people who've been doing it for many years, who are really quick at editing. That could be really great. You probably wouldn't get the all-round sort of strategy support. So you might want to pay an agency like us, I don't know, between £1,000 and £4,000 a month to make 2 episodes a month, and you'd get wraparound support and all of the strategy as well.
So a good thing to do is actually to come to you and go, this is my budget. What could I do well?
Yeah,
and maybe so I'll do it that way, because it's like how long's a piece of string,
Yeah.
isn't it? There's so much levels of complexity and editing and nuggets. So if you come and say, look, I've got £20,000, what could I do with that? And then have a bit of that mapping, probably the better way of looking at it.
Really useful to know what budget you have, because you know, we can. I always say to people, you know, we can tailor something to a budget. We can do everything, you know, but then what we would do is we'd work with you and then say, okay, well, you're going to do all of the research, or you're going to coordinate all of the booking with your guests, and we don't have to do any of that. So then that's a cost saved. Or you might say, well, we're happy to do all of the publishing of the episodes and paying for the hosting platform and everything like that. So that's another cost saved. So yeah, I think having an idea of what you want to spend and then tailoring the approach accordingly is pretty good.
Good place to start. Thank you all very much. We shall wrap up there. So this is our final podcast. So our final webinar, not podcast, got podcast in my head. So if you've missed any of these, this is the Impact Toolkit program. This is where you need to be. I will also share out with everybody a little bit of a wrap-up email of where you can find all the assets, the YouTube links, and get some feedback. This was a pilot. We put these sessions together based upon feedback that Robin had in his role at University of Bristol. Robin is currently still on mute with his microphone off. It's all his fault that we ran all of these. And we want to hear your feedback and your thoughts about what you'd like if we get to do another series, and who you'd like to hear from. I think what's really come across for me is the practical nitty-gritty sessions have been really popular. We want to know how get moving. And I hope we've inspired everyone to have a go at Canva, to have a go at podcasting, to have a go at building a website, to have a go at building an app last week. I didn't realize how good the low code solutions were. I thought app building in low code was all still a bit techie for me. I'm up for it. Mark Cordroy made it really easy. So if nothing else, we hope we've inspired you to go and share your projects in some different ways. So thank you all very much, and go and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.